Joshua is a very interesting book in the Scriptures. If we take the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy, we could describe those books as being books that lead the children of Israel or bring us through their time up to their entrance into Canaan. But when we look at the book of Joshua, Joshua is the book that shows us that they enter the promised land. It begins a set of 12 books leading up to Esther that are considered historical books. And these books cover Israel's history inside Canaan. It's a book of military campaigns and conquest. I like reading about battles. I like reading, I love reading about the Battle of Gettysburg. I love going over to Gettysburg and seeing all the different sites and seeing all the different strategies that were used between the North and the South. And I love reading about battles where the ones that I'm rooting for win. And that's taking place in the book of Joshua. The children of Israel have many, many military conquests, many areas to conquer, and God helps them to conquer most of them throughout the book of Joshua. It's exciting. Baxter divided the book this way. He said chapters 1 through 5 would be entering the land, chapters 6 through 12 would be overcoming the land, and chapters 13 through 24 are dealing with occupying the land. If we were to take the book of Joshua and compare it to the book of Numbers, we would find 2 opposite reactions by the nation of Israel. In the book of Numbers, remember, they were faithless. Remember, in the book of Numbers, because of their faithlessness or their unbelief, it brought failure. It brought them to the wilderness. It brought them to frustration. But when we look at the book of Joshua as a whole, it was a book where they took steps of faith and entered what God had for them. It's a wonderful book. 1 John 5:4 could sum up the book of Joshua. For whatsoever is born of God overcometh the world. And this is the victory that overcometh the world, even our faith. And so when we look at this land of Canaan that Israel entered into in this wonderful book in the Bible, we find that Canaan was the place that God had promised them rest. When they would enter the land of Canaan, it would be a place of rest. It would not only be a place of rest, but it would be a place of provision. Remember, God promised that when you enter Canaan, you will have a place that's flowing with milk and honey, or there will be an abundance to provide for your every need. It was a place of victory, and as you well know and have been taught over the years, Canaan is a place that could be described in our lives as the victorious Christian life. And so we want to take a look at this particular book over the next number of weeks, and I've entitled the series of these messages, Principles for Spiritual Success. You know, all of us need success spiritually. And there are some principles in the book of Joshua that if we can grab a hold of, if we can understand, if we can apply to our lives, it will bring us, those principles applied and practiced will bring us spiritual success. It's a book that's full of progress. I like progress. It's a book of advancement and victory and encouragement and instruction. It's a book at times that has warnings in it. It's a running journal of Israel under Joshua's leadership. And when we start the book in Joshua 1 and Joshua chapter 2, God lays out and establishes some basic truths that if Israel is going to succeed under Joshua's leadership, there are going to be some principles that they have to live by. And so I've asked the Lord over the past number of months, Lord, as a new pastor, what could I share with the core of our church? That's the people that come on Sunday nights and Wednesday nights. What could be a help to them as we begin a journey together at Mount Zion Baptist Church? And I believe that this is what God would have me to share. I want you to understand some background to the book. The nation of Israel, up to Joshua chapter 1, had been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. They had been under Moses' leadership. Certainly they had had some highs, and they had some great lows that they could recount. I'm sure they could remember living through the plagues and seeing God deliver them from the nation of Egypt. I mean, can you imagine going through the 10 plagues in the Old Testament, thinking, when is this ever going to end? Are we ever going to get out from under the rulership of Pharaoh? And then God delivers, and they cross the Red Sea, and Pharaoh's chariots come in behind, and the waters come in on them. And I believe the children of Israel could remember those things. But I'm sure they could also remember the golden calf, and Moses' anger, and God's anger with it. I'm sure they could remember when God showered down manna from heaven, and God led them with the pillar of fire and the cloud by day. I'm sure they could remember those things. Yet they could remember the bitter waters of Marah, where after wandering for 3 days in the wilderness and having no water, they went to Marah to drink, and the waters were bitter, which revealed the discontent in their heart as they complained. We find that story in the book of Exodus in chapter number 15. For the past 40 years, they had been wandering because they did not have faith to conquer Canaan. The 10 spies had brought back a faithless report, and they ended up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Moses has just died at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. In fact, if you go to the end of the book of Deuteronomy, right up above Joshua chapter 1, we'll read about that. Verse number 7 of chapter number 34 of the book of Deuteronomy says, Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated. The children of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. So the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. And then they come into the present, and new leadership is established, and God makes known in the beginning of Joshua that really God's principles for success haven't changed. They didn't change from when Moses was leader to when Joshua became leader. The principle that I really want you to get tonight in the message is this. Principle number 1 for spiritual success is that we must remember that God is in charge and let Him be in charge. I want to show you that from the Scriptures tonight, because with God in charge, God led the nation of Israel even after Moses is dead. In verse number 2 of Joshua chapter 1, the Bible says, Moses, thy servant, is dead. Who's speaking here? God is speaking, according to verse number 1. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, thou and all this people, unto the land which I do give to them, even to the children of Israel. I want you to see 3 things tonight that reminds us that God is in charge, He's in control, and these 3 things ought also to remind us to let God be in charge. Number 1, God turned their minds from the past to the future. Let me encourage you tonight that when we allow God to be in charge, when we remember that God is in charge, it ought to cause us to focus on the future. That's what took place with Joshua. That's what took place with the nation of Israel. They had been through a very trying time here in their life, in their nation's history. They'd been through 40 years of wandering. Their leader had just passed off the scene. But God says, it's time for you to arise. It's time for you to move forward in your life. Yes, you can remember some great things from the past, and yes, there have been highs and lows, but today is a day for you to move forward, and God began by giving that to the leaders. What God was saying is this: Moses, the servant of God, is dead, but God the Master is not dead. God's work, listen to me carefully tonight, God's work is not primarily about His servants. God can move and shift people around. No man or woman is irreplaceable in the work of God, and none of us ought to have that kind of mentality as we serve the Lord, like, if God loses me, they're really in trouble. No, God uses people, and God can move people in all kinds of different places that He wants to use them. It is God that does the work. He does the work through His servants, but His servants aren't the primary pieces. We ought not to get exalted about what we're doing for God. We ought to instead exalt God for what He's doing in our midst. None ought to ever come to the point that they think that, boy, without me, they'd really be hurting. No, that's not true. That's not true in the church. It's not true. In God's work, God can replace pieces to the puzzle. If I passed off the scene today, this is God's work. It's not any man's work. God builds His church. People don't do what God can do. And so we need to be reminded tonight that it is about God. And God helps us to focus on the future. Yet, in our human minds, when we go through difficult circumstances in life or in church life, certainly our human minds may think like this: can there be any after? After what we've been through? In my marriage, can there be any after? After the difficulties that we've been through. For the nation of Israel, Moses was the only leader they had known. There was a great void that was left. For some, I'm sure it felt like the very end of the road. And God gives us the ability to feel those feelings. But notice that God turned their eyes towards the future, towards moving forward. You ever had your eyes so focused on something, your mind so focused on something that you couldn't hear or see anything else? Ladies, you ever try to talk to your husband when he's watching a game? Pretty worthless endeavor. Men get pretty focused on those things. They're focused. God knew that Israel's sorrow over losing Moses, listen to me carefully, could paralyze them for months or years without accomplishing anything for God. And so God gives them this verse in chapter 2. He gives them this command, this instruction. Now therefore, arise and cross over Jordan. But God, we just lost our leader. But God, we've been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. They certainly must have been weary. But God, we're facing sorrow in our lives. God said to Joshua, arise. It's time to conquer some land. It's time to move over. Let's move forward. God was not being insensitive to what Joshua or Israel had been through or how they felt. But He also knew that the greatest thing that would help them would be to change their focus and move forward. I am sure some struggled with this, but God set the course for the future. We must turn our eyes to what God has His eyes on, the future for our lives and for our church. I want you to see a second thing that came to the forefront in this particular passage as we look at God being in charge and letting God be in charge, and that is that they were to do their duty. Joshua chapter 1, verse number 2, he begins with Joshua. He says, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, thou and all this people, unto the land which I do give to them, even to the children of Israel. God had a duty for them. The duty was to cross the Jordan. He spoke to Joshua, the leader, and said, I want you to get it from my heart to your heart. I want you to have my mind. I want you to have direction as to where we're supposed to go. And then I want the people to follow you to accomplish what I have in my heart for you to accomplish. Parker wrote this, doing our duty is God's gospel to the dejected. It is God's medicine for those who suppose themselves to be wounded incurably. Listen to me carefully. You know this if you've ever faced a season of darkness in your life, a season of very difficult times. Your ambition to get up and get busy about the work that you normally do on an everyday basis is lacking when you're in those times. It's hard to just get up and do what you are supposed to do. Many of you could relate to such times in your lives where you went through what I'm talking about. And certainly the children of Israel were feeling some of this as God spake in verse number 2. Listen to me carefully tonight. If you continue to sit around and stew over loss, you'll have more things to sorrow and be upset over. The greatest thing that you can do when you're struggling inwardly, when you're discouraged, when you're depressed, when you're fighting just to put one foot in front of the other, is to do your duty. That's what God's teaching us here. Do your duty.